as your baby's head is descending, as things are happening, sometimes it allows air to escape your anus in something that we commonly refer to as a fart. Hello to all of you beautiful birthing people. Welcome back to my channel. My name is Elizabeth, also known as Nurse Sabe, here on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, and I am a labor and delivery nurse and certified childbirth educator. And today I am coming at you with another video in my series, Things Nobody Told Me About, and we are going to be talking about epidurals. So an epidural may or may not be in your birth plan, but I think it's important to know what it is, even if it's not something that you're planning on receiving, because an epidural, like any other tool in our labor toolbox, can be a really effective way for us to continue to cope through our labor, continue to dilate, and to deliver a baby that is happy and healthy and safe. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. So I already have a video, 10 things your labor nurse wants you to know about an epidural, and it kind of goes over positioning, everything like that. But real quick, I just want to say, hey, what is an epidural? So an epidural is a anesthesia medication that can be used to control labor pain, and it is our best medication that we have on board to control labor pain. And what happens is the anesthesiologist will come in and place a small catheter into the epidural space in your back, and you will have a continuous flow of medication, as well as often a patient controlled button where you can give yourself extra medication as needed to control labor pains. It does a really good job of controlling pain from right about here to right about here is our goal, controlling those labor pains, and it often leaves you with numb or dimmed sensation in your lower half because the medication is going all the way through. An epidural is a choice that we see made for about 68% of people giving birth to their first baby in the United States. And it does go down to about 57% for people who are having their second or greater births. So one of the first things that you're going to discover after you receive your epidural is that the medication is gravity dependent. It's like that song, starts in your toes, makes me twinkle my nose.
Starts in my toes and I crinkle my nose.
Or whatever, I don't know the words, but it starts in your toes and it works its way up. So the first sensation that you might feel after receiving your epidural is that your legs start to feel heavy and tingly. A good description is often, if you sit on your leg funny or you sleep on your arm funny and that appendage falls asleep and pins and needles feels really weird. That's kind of how an epidural feels in your legs. So when you're getting your epidural, the thing that is actually painful is the numbing with the lidocaine. That kind of feels like a giant bee sting. But if you have been laboring and doing your thing and dealing with some really strong, hard contractions, often it doesn't feel like much of anything, which is great. After that, you should just feel pressure of them putting that needle in your back. It should not be painful. If it is painful, please communicate that. I really like for my patients to communicate with me with the epidural process if they're having a contraction or not, so that I can help guide them through the contraction, as opposed to if they're feeling pain in their back that we need more numbing medication for. The other thing that we see sometimes with that catheter being threaded through the needle is you will feel a zinger, almost like a funny bone feeling, like if you hit your elbow, go down one leg or the other. That is that catheter rubbing up against a nerve. It should be temporary and it is really, really normal. Now I am going to show you guys, because I think that this is helpful in visualizing and understanding epidurals and kind of the things that could differentiate between different epidurals, or why an epidural might not work 100%. Because the next thing that I want to talk about, and this is not to scare you, but just to prepare you, sometimes epidurals do not work 100%. Sometimes they have a spot where they're not working. Sometimes you might have really heavy legs, but it doesn't get all the way up to your belly. Sometimes it might even feel like you're feeling it up a little bit too high. And these are all things that we can deal with, but I just want you to be prepared that there is the possibility that this could happen. And the reason why, turn away now if you do not want to see an epidural needle. This is what's getting pushed into your back. You can see it's really quite large, and you can see it has a bevel right here. Ideally, when they're putting that epidural in, they're pushing this further into your back and they're injecting sterile water. Once the flow of sterile water goes in easily, that's how they know that they're in the epidural space. But after that happens, they have to thread a catheter in. This thin, flexible catheter is all that's left in your back, not this big scale. Bless. And so when they are threading this catheter in, their goal is bevel up, the catheter goes in, right? And it's slightly pointed up. Trying to see if we can see. Let me get a darker background for you to kind of look at this through. So you see bevel up, slightly going up. But there is a chance that that epidural catheter might go more to one side than the other. It might be bent down a little bit. And so that is when we see that medication not going exactly where we want it to go. So for instance, if it's going down, you might have your legs are really numb and heavy, but the medication doesn't reach all the way up to your belly. Or if it's going to one side versus the other, you might notice that you have what we refer to as a hot spot. So one half of your body is very well covered, and then one half, or just even a spot on one half, you are still feeling all of the contraction pain. That is absolutely miserable. And the good news is a lot of times we can fix this. So your epidural can take a while to work. It's not instantaneous. It can take 15 to 20 minutes for you to feel the full effect of the medication. But if after that 15 to 20 minutes you are still feeling a lot of pain, you need to let your nurse know, you need to let your anesthesiologist know, because there are some steps that we can take to help that epidural to work better. The nurse could adjust your position so that you're in a position where if you have one side that needs more medication, that side will actually go down or towards the bed to get medication to flow in that direction, because we do have that gravity dependency. One step that they might consider is giving you extra medication to kind of get the epidural up to working level for you. So they would just push extra medication through this thin flexible tube and give you some extra medication that way. The other thing that they might consider doing is pulling back a little bit on this epidural catheter to get it into a more optimal position. They don't want to pull it out of the epidural space, but they want to pull it back so that it is maybe more going up and not going to one side or the other. And the reason why it could go to one side or the other could be anatomical issues with you, it could be issues with the bevel, but it's not something that we can really control for. The good news is if it happens once, it's not something that's guaranteed to happen again. If none of those things are working, the other thing that we might consider is putting in a new epidural, which obviously is not fun. It is not the goal. It's not what anybody wants to do. But if you are seeking pain control and that first epidural is not working well, it's honestly really miserable. Other thing that might happen is that your epidural is working really well, and then your baby drops lower in your pelvis. We have a rapid dilation. Our contractions all of a sudden get way stronger because labor is progressing, and wow, now you're hurting again. And that is when we have this really wonderful patient-controlled button a lot of the times that you are able to press. Often I will have a patient press that. We'll turn to whatever side is more uncomfortable. We'll wait about 10 minutes, and if that still isn't covering it, then we call the anesthesiologist to come in and kind of examine what's going on and see if they need to give an extra bolus of medication. Now, sometimes all this means is that we just need to have a baby, and it will actually be faster to push and have a baby than it would be to bolus or give more medication in the epidural. And we're always towing that fine line of being comfortable and numb, but not being so numb that pushing becomes really challenging, because that's the other thing that sometimes can happen with an epidural. So in the perfect world with a perfect epidural, you still have some good movement of your legs. You are feeling some pressure now when we are pushing. Sometimes this is just a hint of pressure. I like to call it like the LaCroix of pressure. But as you feel a contraction building, you feel more intense pressure that kind of helps you to push in the right spot and know that it's time to push. If you aren't feeling pressure, that's okay. So we have a couple of options. If you can push without feeling pressure, perfect, love it. A lot of times when it's not your first baby, the ability to feel pressure is not as important because you've pushed a baby before, the passageway has kind of been forged by your first baby. But if you're not feeling pressure and you're having a really hard time pushing, we can wait and let your body naturally bring baby down a little bit lower so that you are feeling that pressure. My goal and my ideal is that you are feeling pressure. The other options we can have after a discussion with your provider, with your anesthesiologist, is turning the epidural down or off. It's not an immediate change in how you're feeling, it takes a little while to wear off. So I actually had both of these scenarios happen a few weeks ago when I was working. So an epidural that was not working, we thought, are we gonna replace it? But she was fully dilated, second baby, we just went ahead and had a baby. That was her choice, that's what she wanted to do. I had another patient whose epidural, she was feeling really, really numb and feeling like the epidural was too high. She was feeling like it was impeding her ability to breathe. And we reminded her, you know, if you're talking, you're breathing, your oxygen saturation is 100%, but we also went ahead and we turned off the epidural because the epidural doesn't, when it's turned off, go away automatically. Body still has to metabolize the medication. And so in about 2 hours time, she was fully dilated. It again was not her first baby. And she was able to comfortably push and deliver her baby, and the epidural was off this entire time. I wanted to talk a little bit about the best time to get an epidural. There is no perfect time for everybody, right? The best time to get an epidural is when you feel like your coping with pain has turned into suffering. And this is not always going to be the same with cervical dilation for everybody. So my goal, ideally, perfect world, is to have baby in an optimal position. So in an LOA position where baby's is facing the maternal spine, slightly tilted to the left hip, and that we are about 6 centimeters dilated. That is goal, perfect, chef's kiss, great time to get an epidural. But you might come in really, really hurting and really uncomfortable and feel like you need an epidural at 3 centimeters. That's gonna be a discussion that you have with your provider. I got my epidural with my first at 3 centimeters. So studies show that early epidurals do not necessarily increase the length of labor and can slightly increase the length of pushing. But I think what we really need to wrap our heads around and think about is how much more we have to be cognizant of position changes once we get that epidural if baby is not in an optimal position to get baby in an optimal position. So ideally you are upright and moving in that early labor phase. You have a nurse who's working with you to help get baby in optimal birth position before we get our epidural. But again, the ability to relax with the epidural and totally release a tension that you might be holding does help with cervical dilation. So there are times and people who maybe are stuck at a certain cervical dilation, not seeing a whole bunch of change, really having a hard time relaxing, who get an epidural and all of a sudden dilate very quickly and beautifully. So the epidural is not your gateway to having a cesarean birth or your gateway to other interventions. Now, one thing that I do find very interesting is that if you have an epidural, your baby is more likely to be in an OP position, meaning that the baby's spine is facing the maternal spine, baby is looking forward. And I've got to wonder, what came first, chicken or the egg, right? I think really a baby who's in an OP position causes more back labor and more discomfort, has irregular contractions that are really hard to cope through sometimes. And so that might make the decision that you've moved from pain to suffering, getting an epidural. So did the baby become OP because of an epidural, which is possible if we're not doing good position changes, or was the baby already OP and making things more painful, necessitating your desire for an epidural? Things to think about. Because, and I've already touched on this, position changes are so vital after you get an epidural. And your labor nurse, because now often you don't have as much intuitive movement going on to help guide you through that, is having to play detective and engineer and all sorts of things to kind of picture, okay, where is baby in the pelvis? What part of the pelvis do I want to open? Where is baby in relation to the maternal spine? What position is baby facing? Has baby tucked their little chin? Because we know a nice tucked chin in that LOA position is going to give us the smallest diameter to come out. Now, with an epidural, we want to be changing our position every 45 minutes, sometimes at night I will push it, and we want to understand it might just be a very slight position change or a very dramatic position change. One of my absolute favorite things to do if I have a baby who is malpositioned is assist people on getting up on hands and knees, which can be done in a labor bed. Even with a pretty dense epidural, if we have some movement of our legs, I will drape them over a peanut ball in the front so that they can still rock back and forth or side to side, because you still can move, and your nurse and your partner can help you with moving your body, because we know movement is magical. And we then can drop the foot of the bed down so that you have a ledge to put your legs. Now we do want to be very, very, very careful when we are doing position changes, when we are manipulating your body if you can't feel, because we want to be protective of your joints and ligaments. And, you know, I, with an epidural, probably could do a split, whereas in real life I cannot do a split, and I should not do a split with an epidural because that's gonna hurt things. Now when we're talking about that epidural, we've mentioned how it relaxes everything. It can definitely aid in dilation if we are holding a lot of tension, fighting the contractions, which happens when we move from pain to suffering. But the other thing that the epidural does is it relaxes everything. So it relaxes your blood vessels as well. And what this can do, and our most common side effect that we see with an epidural, is a drop in blood pressure. So before you get your epidural, you will get a bag of fluid through your IV. This might be normal saline or lactated ringers, just a bag of pretty neutral fluid to help open up that epidural space and give you a little bit of extra fluid to support your blood pressure. What you might feel is you might all of a sudden feel like really dizzy or lightheaded. You might feel like you're going to throw up. You might feel like there's like a tunnel vision happening. Or sometimes before you realize it, baby feels the effects, because when we have a lower blood pressure, we are having less blood flow to the placenta, and baby's like, no thank you, I am not a fan. And we might see a dip in the fetal heart rate. So if we see changes in the fetal heart rate, if you are feeling funky, or if we do see a drop in your blood pressure, we can support you with medications like ephedrine or phenylephrine to bring that blood pressure back up. And often the anesthesiologist will also be at the bedside. The other common side effect that we see in about 1 in 100 epidurals is that epidural needle goes a little bit too far and into the spinal space. Because that epidural needle is larger than if you get a spinal, this can lead to something called a wet tap. And basically what happens is when the catheter is removed, when the needle is removed, we have a leakage of spinal fluid into the epidural space. This will reseal itself in about a week, but while it's doing that, you will have literally the worst headache of your life. That is positional. So when you sit up, the headache's really bad. When you lie down, the headache's not so bad. Treatment that we can do for this is we can give you lots and lots of caffeine. That can sometimes help. Lots and lots of fluid to just kind of replenish. And then also a blood patch where they actually take some of your own blood and inject it into that space, thinking that we can form a little clot and patch up that area. A spinal headache is miserable. If you have had one, I am so sorry. The last thing that I think maybe nobody tells you about an epidural is that sometimes, because everything is so relaxed, like we've mentioned, and loosey-goosey, as your baby's head is descending, as things are happening, sometimes it allows air to escape your anus in something that we commonly refer to as a fart. Honestly, you don't need to say excuse me either. It's kind of funny. It breaks the tension in the room if there is any, and you cannot control it, so never feel bad. This goes in the same level as pooping when you're pushing. You cannot control it, never feel bad. Unfortunately, it's a little bit harder for me to conceal from you because it is an audible noise, but it's one of the things that happens in labor and delivery, and what happens here stays here, so you don't need to worry a thing about it. Anyway, those are all my things that you might not have known about an epidural. Definitely, if you've had a baby, if you've experienced it, let me know down below. If you've heard any stories or horror stories, which I don't know why people love to share, leave them down below and we can kind of dispel any myths that might be there to help put your mind at ease. And just know that an epidural can be an amazing tool that you may or may not want or need for the birth of your baby, and that your nurse is here to support whatever you decide that you need. So until next time, bye guys.